Old black woman was mocked and walked out of the restaurant. Then the Korean mafia boss ran after her. Dorothy Turner walked out of Riverton Prime with her chin lifted and her hands shaking. She hadn't been thrown out. She hadn't caused a scene. She'd been dismissed. The quiet kind of cruelty that hides behind policy and dress codes. And the lie that everyone is treated the same. Dorothy knew better. She was old enough to recognize when "we're fully booked" really meant "not you." So she left. But then someone came running after her. Fast footsteps. Urgent. Like she was something precious that had just slipped away. A man burst through the doors, tall, sharply dressed, clearly important, and shouted her name loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Dorothy, please wait." Dorothy froze. Because she didn't know him. But he knew her. Why? Dorothy Turner had arrived at Riverton Prime 20 minutes early. She always arrived early. It was the habit of someone who never wanted to be a burden, who never wanted to make people wait. She had saved for this meal. Not to show off. Not to prove anything. Just because sometimes you deserve to sit somewhere nice, to eat something you didn't cook yourself, to feel like the world has a place for you too. She had walked through those glass doors wearing her best coat, worn but clean, and asked the hostess Madison for a table for one. Madison had looked her up and down like she was reading a price tag she couldn't afford. "We're fully booked," Madison said. Even though Dorothy could see empty tables behind her, white linens untouched, candles unlit. Dorothy nodded. She wasn't new to this. She asked quietly if she could wait at the bar. Madison's smile hardened. "The bar is reserved for dining guests." Dorothy had pointed gently to a couple seated at the bar, eating appetizers and laughing over wine. "They have reservations," Madison said, her tone sharpening. Dorothy had reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. Cash she'd set aside. The kind you carry when you know some places don't take you seriously unless they can see you're not asking for charity. Madison didn't even look at it. Instead, she leaned toward a server named Brett and muttered something under her breath. Dorothy wasn't meant to hear it. But she did. "Probably wants water and free bread." Brett snorted. Dorothy felt the heat rise in her chest, the familiar weight of humiliation pressing down. She had a choice. Argue and confirm every assumption they'd already made about her, or walk away and keep the one thing they couldn't take. Her dignity. She turned. She walked out. She told herself what she'd told herself 100 times before in 100 different rooms. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you break. Now, standing on the sidewalk with the afternoon sun on her face and the noise of the city around her, Dorothy told herself she'd done the right thing. She had left. She had kept her pride. But then she heard the footsteps. Not the shuffle of a waiter with a fake apology. Not the bored stride of security. These were fast. Desperate. Like someone who had just realized they were about to lose something they couldn't afford to lose. A man burst through the same glass doors Dorothy had just walked through. Tall. Black suit that looked expensive without trying. Hair swept back, but his face was raw, alarmed, almost afraid. People inside turned to stare. People outside slowed down to watch. And the man called out, his voice cutting through the street noise. "Dorothy, please wait." Dorothy didn't turn around right away. She stood there, staring at the passing cars, wondering if she could just keep walking and pretend she hadn't heard. But the man moved closer, careful, like he understood he was stepping into fragile territory. His hand lifted, palm open. Not grabbing. Not forcing. Just asking. "Ma'am," he said, his voice lower now, softer. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry they did that." Dorothy swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight. "I don't want trouble," she said, "because that's what you learn to say when powerful people approach you. I was leaving. That's all." The man shook his head, rejecting the whole idea of her having to leave at all. "No," he said firmly. "You were pushed." Dorothy finally turned. Up close, she could see the details. The faint edge of a tattoo at his collar, the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes kept flicking back toward the restaurant windows where people were watching. He knew he had an audience. And he didn't care. His name was Kim Suk-jin. To most people, he was a private investor, the kind who appeared at charity events and ribbon cuttings. But to those who paid attention, to people who worked late and heard whispers in quiet rooms, he was something else entirely. He was the head of a Korean organization that handled problems before they became public. A man whose power didn't need headlines. And he was standing on a downtown sidewalk, in broad daylight, refusing to let an old black woman walk away. Dorothy's eyes narrowed. Why do you know my name? Kim Suk-jin's jaw tightened. For the first time his confidence wavered. Because, he said carefully, you saved my life. Dorothy blinked. I've never met you. Yes you have, he replied. Just not like this. He glanced back toward the restaurant, and Dorothy followed his gaze. Madison was watching from the window. Brett too. A few diners had stood up, no longer pretending they weren't staring. The restaurant had dismissed Dorothy when they thought no one important was paying attention. Now someone important was paying attention, and the whole building could feel it. Kim Suk-jin took a breath. 3 months ago, he said. Union Station. South entrance. Rainy night. And just like that, Dorothy's memory stirred, reluctant, dim but undeniable. Hello my friends and loved ones. Thanks for joining me on this beautiful story. As we continue this story, kindly take a moment to subscribe to this channel, like the video, and I love to always hear from you. Where are you watching from and what time is it at your end right now? Thank you for subscribing. Dorothy's memory flickered like an old film reel, grainy, uncertain, but slowly coming into focus. Union Station. 3 months ago. Late evening after her church meeting. She'd been tired, moving slower than she used to, when she saw him near the taxi line. A young man. Pale. Sweating. Trying to stand straight while his body betrayed him. There'd been a commotion nearby, some kind of argument, and people had scattered, too busy protecting themselves to notice the stranger who looked like he might collapse. But Dorothy had noticed. She always noticed. She'd grabbed his arm, guided him to a bench, pressed her own scarf into his trembling hands. She'd asked him one question, sharp and practical. Have you eaten today? He tried to answer, but the words stumbled. Dorothy had pulled a peppermint from her purse, because she always carried peppermints, and pressed it into his palm. Put it in your mouth. Now. Then she'd flagged down transit security and stayed until his color returned. She hadn't asked his name. Hadn't asked why his hands were shaking or why 2 men in dark coats suddenly appeared, searching the crowd like they'd misplaced something priceless. Dorothy had walked away when he could breathe again. Because to her, that was the end of it. Now, standing on the sidewalk outside Riverton Prime, Dorothy looked at Kim Suk-jin and felt the pieces shift into place. That was you, she said slowly. Kim noted. And those men in the coats, they were mine. Dorothy's stomach dipped. Not with fear. With realization. You're telling me you're important, she said flatly. And now you feel guilty. Kim's eyes flashed. No. I ran after you because you're being treated like you're nothing. And that's not just wrong, it's dangerous. Dangerous? Dorothy echoed. Inside the restaurant, Madison had moved closer to the window, her face tight with forced calm. Brett stood beside her, no longer smirking. Other diners had stopped eating, their forks suspended midair as they watched the scene unfold. Kim leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Dorothy could hear. Someone inside that restaurant recognized you, he said. Not for the way you look. For who you are. Dorothy's fingers tightened around her purse. Kim's gaze slid toward the glass. A man named Ethan. He's sitting in the back, near the wine wall. And he's been asking questions about you for weeks. Dorothy's breath caught. She knew an Ethan. Not well. Just a name from an old chapter of her life she didn't talk about. Years ago, when she'd worked as a night cleaner in a courthouse and overheard things she shouldn't have. She'd reported something quietly once. Something that saved an innocent person from being blamed for a crime they didn't commit. She'd never told anyone. Not even her family. Kim watched her face and understood. You remember, he said softly. Dorothy didn't answer. Kim straightened, his voice rising just enough for the watching crowd to hear. Dorothy Turner, he said, clear and steady. You are not leaving here like you did something wrong. Dorothy's eyes stung, but she refused to cry. Come back inside, Kim said. Not for them. For you. And because if someone is hunting for you, I want them to see you standing next to me. Dorothy looked past him at the restaurant. At Madison's stiff smile already forming. At Brett's discomfort. At strangers who'd been happy to ignore her 5 minutes ago, now suddenly interested. She had walked away her whole life to keep her dignity. Maybe today, dignity meant something else. Maybe today, dignity meant turning around. Dorothy lifted her chin. "All right," she said quietly. "But you're not buying me anything." Kim's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost respect. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Then let's go make them treat you like you've always mattered." And together, they stepped toward the glass doors, while the whole restaurant held its breath, realizing too late that the woman they'd mocked was the one person in the room who couldn't be erased. 3 months ago, the rain had been coming down hard that night, turning Union Station's south entrance into a maze of wet umbrellas and hurried footsteps. Dorothy had been coming back from her Wednesday evening church meeting, moving slower than she used to, her knees aching from the damp cold. The station was crowded, commuters rushing for trains, tourists huddled under the overhang, street vendors packing up their carts. Near the taxi line, a fight had broken out. Two men shouting, shoving, drawing a circle of onlookers who kept a careful distance. Dorothy had been edging around the crowd when she saw him. A young man in a dark coat, leaning against a concrete pillar, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His face was pale, not just tired pale but gray. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. His breathing was shallow, his hand pressed against his chest. Everyone else was watching the fight. Dorothy watched him. She moved closer, her church shoes splashing through puddles, and touched his arm gently. "Son," she said, "you need to sit down." The young man tried to shake his head, tried to say he was fine, but his knees buckled slightly. Dorothy didn't wait for permission. She guided him to a nearby bench, her grip firm despite her age. She pulled off her own scarf, warm, knitted by her granddaughter, and pressed it into his trembling hands. "Hold this," she told him, "and breathe slow." His eyes were unfocused, blinking too fast. Dorothy had seen this before. Years ago when her husband had diabetes, when her neighbor's son had panic attacks. The body shutting down, the mind unable to catch up. "Have you eaten today?" she asked, her voice sharp and practical. The young man tried to answer, but the words came out slurred. Dorothy didn't wait. She reached into her purse and pulled out a peppermint, the kind she always carried, wrapped in clear plastic. She unwrapped it and placed it firmly in his palm. "Put it in your mouth," she said. "Now." He obeyed, his movements slow and mechanical. Dorothy flagged down a transit security officer, explained what she'd seen, and asked him to bring water. The officer radioed for medical assistance, but Dorothy stayed planted on that bench, one hand on the young man's shoulder, keeping him grounded. "You're all right," she told him quietly. "Just breathe." Minutes passed. The peppermint helped. The security officer returned with water. Slowly, color returned to the young man's face. That's when Dorothy noticed them. Two men in dark coats, different from the young man's but clearly expensive, appeared at the edge of the crowd. They moved with purpose, scanning faces, their expressions tight with something Dorothy recognized as fear. Not fear for themselves. Fear of consequence. One of them spotted the young man on the bench and exhaled sharply, relief flooding his features. He spoke quickly into a phone, never taking his eyes off the scene. Dorothy didn't ask questions. She had lived long enough to know when questions were dangerous. When the young man could breathe normally again, when his hands stopped shaking and his eyes focused, Dorothy stood. "You're going to be all right," she said. The young man looked up at her, his voice hoarse. "Thank you." Dorothy nodded once, then turned and walked away, melting back into the crowd before the two men in dark coats could reach her. To her, that was the end of it. Now, Kim Suk-jin stood on the sidewalk outside Riverton Prime, his expression raw in a way that made him look younger than he was. "That was me," he said quietly. "And those men, they were mine. My security detail." Dorothy studied him, seeing the young man on the bench beneath the polished exterior. "You weren't supposed to be alone," she said. "Not a question." Kim shook his head. "I'd slipped out. I needed air. I needed to feel normal for 5 minutes." His voice hardened. "And if you hadn't stopped, if you hadn't noticed, I would have gone down in the middle of that crowd." He met her eyes. "People like me don't get to go down in public." The glass doors of Riverton Prime swung open, and Dorothy Turner walked back inside with her head up and her shoulders squared. Kim Suk-jin walked beside her, not in front, not behind. Beside her, like an equal. The restaurant's energy shifted instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence. Silverware paused over plates. Eyes tracked their movement across the polished floor like they were watching something they couldn't quite believe. Madison appeared within seconds, her smile stretched too wide. Her voice climbing into a register Dorothy recognized immediately. Panic disguised as professionalism. "Oh, welcome back," Madison said brightly, as if Dorothy had simply stepped out for air. "We actually just had a table open up. Such perfect timing." Dorothy said nothing. She simply looked at Madison and waited. Kim's voice was calm. Quiet. But it carried. "You told Ms. Turner you were fully booked." Madison's smile flickered. "Well, there was a mix-up with the reservation system." "Which tables were booked?" Kim asked, gesturing toward the dining room where at least 4 tables sat empty, their white linens crisp and untouched. Madison's mouth opened. Closed. She glanced toward Brett, who stood frozen near the bar, suddenly very interested in wiping down a counter that was already clean. "We hold tables for VIP guests," Madison said carefully, "in case they arrive without notice." "I see," Kim said. "And Ms. Turner, who arrived early, who asked politely, who offered to wait, she didn't qualify as someone worth holding a table for?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Madison's face flushed. "It's not about, we have policies." "You also told her the bar was reserved for dining guests," Kim continued, his tone still even. "But those 2 by the window are eating appetizers. And that man near the corner just ordered fries." Brett set down his towel. His face had gone pale. Dorothy watched it all unfold with the stillness of someone who had seen this dance before. She didn't interrupt. Didn't add fuel. She simply stood there, letting their own words trap them. Madison's voice turned pleading. "Sir, I assure you, there was no intent to." "No intent." Kim's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Then why did you tell your coworker Ms. Turner probably wanted water and free bread?" The color drained from Madison's face. Brett looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Dorothy felt a flicker of something she couldn't name. Not satisfaction. Not quite. Something closer to validation. The quiet kind. The kind that comes when the truth finally speaks for itself. Kim turned to Dorothy. "Would you still like to eat here?" Dorothy hesitated. Part of her wanted to leave again, to prove she didn't need their sudden hospitality. But another part, the part that had been walking away her whole life, wanted to stay. "Yes," she said quietly. "I would." Kim nodded once, then gestured toward the dining room. Madison scrambled to grab menus, her hands shaking slightly. As they moved deeper into the restaurant, Kim leaned close to Dorothy and spoke low enough that only she could hear. "Near the wine wall," he said. "Dark jacket. Silver watch." Dorothy followed his gaze. A man sat alone at a corner table, partially obscured by the restaurant's architectural columns. He wasn't eating. Wasn't drinking. He was watching. And when Dorothy's eyes landed on him, recognition hit her like cold water. Ethan. Older now. Grayer. But the same sharp eyes, the same posture that always seemed coiled, ready. He didn't look away when Dorothy saw him. Instead, he lifted his glass slightly. A greeting that felt more like a warning. Dorothy's pulse quickened. Kim's voice was barely a whisper. "That man has been asking about you for weeks." Dorothy tore her gaze away from Ethan and looked at Kim. "Why?" Kim's jaw tightened. "That's what I intend to find out." The name landed in Dorothy's chest like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward into memory. Ethan. Years ago, 15 maybe more, Dorothy had worked nights cleaning the downtown courthouse. 3rd shift, when the lawyers went home and the janitors inherited the marble halls and mahogany offices. She'd been invisible then, the way night workers always are. But invisible doesn't mean blind. One night, she'd been emptying trash in a conference room when she overheard 2 men talking in the hallway. Their voices were low, urgent. One of them had been Ethan, younger then, but unmistakable. They'd been discussing a case. Evidence that needed to disappear. A name that needed to stay buried. Dorothy had kept cleaning. kept her head down. But when she'd seen the news weeks later, an innocent man facing charges for something he didn't do, she'd made a call. So careful. Just enough to point investigators toward the truth. The innocent man had been cleared. Dorothy had never told anyone, and she'd assumed that was the end of it. Now, sitting across the dining room with Kim Suk-jin beside her, Dorothy watched Ethan rise from his table and move toward them with the ease of someone who believed he owned every room he entered. "Dorothy Turner," Ethan said warmly, as if greeting an old friend. "It's been a long time." Dorothy's hands stayed folded in her lap. "I don't believe we've met." Ethan's smile didn't falter. "Of course we have. The courthouse. You used to work nights, didn't you?" Dorothy said nothing. Ethan gestured toward the empty chair at their table. "May I?" Kim's voice was polite but edged. "We're in the middle of something." Ethan ignored him, pulling out the chair and sitting anyway. He looked at Dorothy with the kind of focus that made her skin prickle. "I've been hoping to run into you," Ethan said. "Funny how things work out. You picked the one restaurant where someone I know happens to be dining." "Funny," Kim repeated flatly. Ethan's eyes slid to Kim, assessing. "And you are someone who doesn't like games," Kim said. "Say what you mean." Ethan's smile thinned. He turned back to Dorothy. "I'm just catching up with an old acquaintance. Asking how she's been. What she's been doing. Whether she still remembers the old days." Dorothy kept her voice steady. "I remember enough." "Good," Ethan said. "Because some people have very long memories too. And they're not as forgiving as I am." The words landed like a threat wrapped in velvet. Kim leaned forward slightly, his posture shifting in a way that made the air around the table feel heavier. "You're suggesting Ms. Turner owes someone something," Kim said quietly. Ethan spread his hands. "I'm suggesting that certain acts of, let's call it civic duty, can have unintended consequences. Sometimes helping the wrong person makes you visible to people you'd rather not notice you." Dorothy's pulse hammered in her ears. She thought back to that phone call. The anonymous tip. The man who'd been freed because she'd spoken up. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting to find out who'd interfered. And now they had. "I didn't do anything wrong," Dorothy said, her voice firmer than she felt. Ethan tilted his head. "That depends on your perspective. The man you helped? He caused a lot of problems for people who preferred him locked away. And those people? Well, they've been very patient. Very thorough. Tracking down leads. Asking questions." He paused, letting the words settle. "You should have stayed quiet, Dorothy." Kim's hand moved to the table, his fingers drumming once. A controlled gesture that somehow conveyed absolute authority. "You're threatening her," Kim said. "Not a question." Ethan stood smoothly. "I'm reminding her that silence is a gift. And gifts can be taken back." He looked down at Dorothy one last time. "Enjoy your dinner," he said. "While you still can." Then he walked away, leaving the table in charged silence. Dorothy sat very still, her hands trembling in her lap. Kim leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "Dorothy, look at me." She did. "This night was never about dinner," Kim said. "It was about making you visible. Drawing you out. Confirming you're still here." Dorothy's throat tightened. "So they can erase me?" Kim didn't deny it. Instead, he said something that made Dorothy's blood run cold, and her spine straighten at the same time. "Then we make sure they can't." 15 years ago, the courthouse at night was a different place. Empty hallways that echoed with Dorothy's footsteps. Marble floors that gleamed under fluorescent lights. Offices filled with files and secrets and the weight of decisions that changed lives. Dorothy had been cleaning there for 6 months. Third shift, midnight to 6 a.m. good pay. Quiet work. The kind of job where people forgot you existed the moment you picked up a mop. She'd liked it that way. One Thursday night, Dorothy had been emptying trash in conference room 3C when she heard voices in the hallway. Low. Urgent. The kind of conversation people have when they think no one's listening. She kept working, moving quietly toward the door to empty the recycling bin. "The evidence is clean," a man's voice said. "Henderson's fingerprints are on the weapon. His DNA at the scene. It's airtight. Except he didn't do it." That was Ethan's voice, younger then, but unmistakable. But he's convenient. And he's expendable. So we let it ride. We let it ride. The real guy walks. Henderson takes the fall. Everyone wins. Dorothy's hands had frozen on the trash bag. She'd stood there, heart pounding, mind racing. She knew the case they were talking about. It had been all over the news. An assault. A victim who'd been hospitalized. A suspect named Marcus Henderson who swore he was innocent. Dorothy had kept cleaning. Had walked out of that building at 6 a.m. like nothing had happened. But 2 weeks later, when Henderson's trial date was announced, Dorothy had gone to a payphone 3 neighborhoods away from her own. She'd called the prosecutor's office. Careful. She'd told them to check the security footage from the parking garage again. To look at the timestamps. To verify where Henderson actually was when the crime occurred. She hadn't given details. Hadn't explained how she knew. She just planted the seed and hung up. 3 weeks after that, the charges against Henderson were dropped. New evidence had emerged. A different suspect was arrested. Someone with connections, someone protected, someone who should have been caught the first time. Dorothy never told anyone what she'd done. She'd finished out her contract at the courthouse, then quietly found work elsewhere. She'd learned to stay small. To keep her head down. To never again put herself in a position where knowing the truth could cost her everything. Now, Dorothy sat at the table in Riverton Prime, staring at the spot where Ethan had been standing moments before. Her hands were still trembling. He knows, she said quietly. Kim noted. He's known for a while. But knowing and confirming are different things. Tonight he confirmed it. Dorothy looked up at him. Why now? After all these years? Because Henderson just won a major civil suit, Kim said. Against the city. Against the people who tried to frame him. It's been in the news for weeks. Millions in damages, reputations destroyed. Dorothy's stomach dropped. So they're cleaning up loose ends. Exactly, Kim said. And you're the witness who started it all. Dorothy pressed her palms flat against the table, steadying herself. She'd spent 15 years making herself invisible, believing that staying small would keep her safe. But safety had always been an illusion. I'm tired, Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of shrinking. I'm tired of pretending I don't matter. Kim leaned forward, his expression serious. Then don't. But you need to understand what you're up against. I understand, Dorothy said. Ethan wants me gone. It's not just Ethan, Kim said. People like him don't work alone. If he found you here, in a restaurant you've never been to, on a night you happen to choose, that means someone's been tracking you, watching your patterns, waiting for the right moment. Dorothy's chest tightened. So what do I do? Kim's jaw set. You stop being alone. Dorothy shook her head. I don't need a bodyguard. You need someone who understands how people like Ethan operate, Kim said firmly. Someone who can make sure that if they come for you, they have to go through me first. Dorothy studied him. This man she'd saved without knowing who he was, this stranger who'd run after her on a sidewalk because she'd been dismissed. Why, she asked. Why does this matter so much to you? Kim's expression softened slightly. Because you saw me when I was nothing. When I was vulnerable. When I was just a man who couldn't breathe. He paused. And you treated me like I mattered. Dorothy's eyes stung. Kim's voice dropped lower, urgent now. If Ethan found you here, Dorothy, he can find you anywhere. Your home. Your church. Everywhere you go. Dorothy swallowed hard. Then what's the point of running? Kim's eyes hardened with resolve. We don't run, he said. We fight back. Dorothy excused herself to use the restroom. Kim watched her go, his posture still relaxed, but his eyes tracked every movement in the room. Ethan had returned to his table near the wine wall, his phone out, typing something with deliberate focus. Dorothy moved down the narrow hallway toward the restrooms, her steps slower now, exhaustion settling into her bones. The adrenaline was wearing off, and all she wanted was a moment alone to collect herself. She pushed open the restroom door and found Madison waiting inside. The hostess stood by the sinks, arms crossed, her earlier sweetness completely gone. You need to leave, Madison said flatly. Dorothy stopped. Excuse me. You're causing a disturbance. Madison continued, her voice tight. Other guests are uncomfortable. Management has asked me to escort you out. Dorothy's heart sank. I haven't done anything. You're making a scene, Madison insisted, stepping closer. And if you don't leave quietly, we'll have to call security. Dorothy heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Brett blocking the hallway exit, his phone raised, camera pointed directly at her. Just documenting the situation, Brett said, his voice falsely casual. For liability purposes. Dorothy understood immediately. They were trying to manufacture a scene. Force her into a reaction. Record her looking angry, defensive, unreasonable. Proof she'd been the problem all along. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, but she kept her voice steady. I'm going back to my table. Madison moved to block her path. No. You're leaving. Now. Let me pass, Dorothy said quietly. Make me, Madison hissed, loud enough for Brett's phone to catch it. Dorothy felt the trap closing. If she pushed past Madison, the video would show her being aggressive. If she raised her voice, they'd call her disruptive. If she did nothing, they'd physically remove her. And the story would be about the difficult woman who couldn't follow simple rules. She'd seen this playbook before. Brett's phone stayed raised. Ma'am, you need to comply with staff instructions. Dorothy took a breath, preparing to step backward, to slip past them and out the side exit, to disappear the way she always had. Then she heard Kim's voice, calm and clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. Put the phone down. Brett turned. Kim stood at the end of the hallway, his presence filling the narrow space without him moving an inch. This is restaurant business, Brett said nervously. You're not. Put it down, Kim repeated. Not louder. Just heavier. Brett's hand lowered. Kim's eyes shifted to Madison. Step aside. Madison's face flushed. She's being removed for. For what? Kim asked. Sitting quietly? Eating the meal she paid for? Existing while you're uncomfortable. Madison's mouth opened, but no words came. Kim moved closer, positioning himself between Dorothy and the two staff members. His voice dropped, meant only for them. If you touch her, if you record her, if you do anything except step aside and let her walk out of this hallway with dignity, he paused. You'll answer to me. Personally. Brett went pale. Madison took a step back, her bravado crumbling. Kim turned to Dorothy, his expression softer now. Let's go. Dorothy nodded, moving toward him. They walked back down the hallway together, Kim's hand hovering near her elbow, not touching, just present. When they reached the dining room, Dorothy saw the scattered faces of diners watching, phones half raised, curiosity and judgment mixing in their expressions. She saw Ethan at his table, leaning back with satisfaction, like a man watching a plan unfold exactly as designed. And Dorothy understood. This was it. The moment they wanted. Her leaving in shame, recorded and packaged as proof she'd been the problem all along. She could walk out. Disappear. Let them win quietly. Kim leaned close. We can go. I have a car outside. Dorothy stopped walking. She stood in the center of the dining room, surrounded by strangers who'd been happy to ignore her pain, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger. Not defiance. Clarity. She had spent her whole life walking away to preserve her dignity. But dignity wasn't something you carried in silence. It was something you claimed in the open, especially when people wanted you to disappear. Dorothy turned back toward the room. Kim's hand dropped. Dorothy. No, Dorothy said, her voice quiet but absolute. Not today. She lifted her chin and looked directly at Ethan. I'm not leaving. The dining room went silent. Dorothy stood in the center of the floor, her worn coat still on, her purse clutched in both hands. Every eye in the restaurant was on her. Some curious, some uncomfortable, some waiting to see what would happen next. Kim moved to stand beside her, not in front. Equal ground. He turned to Madison, who'd followed them out of the hallway, her face tight with barely contained panic. Tell everyone here, Kim said calmly, what policy Ms. Turner violated. Madison's mouth opened. Closed. She was causing a disturbance. How? Kim asked. She was. Madison glanced toward Brett for support. She was confrontational with staff. Kim's eyebrow lifted slightly. Ms. Turner asked for a table. You told her you were fully booked. Was that true? Madison's face flushed. We hold tables for. Was it true? Kim repeated, his voice still even. Madison hesitated. Not technically. So you lied, Kim said. Not an accusation. A statement of fact. The room shifted. Whispers started at nearby tables. Kim turned to Brett. You made a comment when Ms. Turner arrived. About water and free bread. Say it again. Out loud. Brett's face went pale. I didn't mean. Say it. Kim insisted gently. Let everyone hear what you meant as a joke. Brett looked at the floor. I said she probably just wanted water and free bread. The whispers grew louder. Dorothy felt something loosen in her chest. Not vindication. Just visibility. The truth, finally spoken in front of witnesses who couldn't unhear it. A woman at a nearby table set down her fork. That's disgusting, she said to her dining companion, loud enough to carry. Another diner pulled out his phone, not to record Dorothy, but to type something quickly. A review maybe. Or a complaint. Ethan stood from his table, moving toward them with measured steps. This is unnecessary theater, Ethan said smoothly. Kim, you're making everyone uncomfortable. Perhaps we should handle this privately. Kim didn't move. Privately? Like you tried to handle Dorothy privately in that hallway? With a camera recording her? Ethan's smile thinned. I don't know what you're talking about. You've been tracking her for weeks, Kim said, his voice dropping lower. You orchestrated this entire evening. You wanted her visible so you could silence her permanently. Ethan's eyes hardened. Be very careful about the accusations you make in public. Or what? Kim asked. You'll do to me what you plan to do to her? The two men stood facing each other, the air between them charged with unspoken threat. Dorothy stepped forward. Both men looked at her. I didn't come here to fight, Dorothy said, her voice quiet but clear. I came here to eat. To sit down in a nice place and feel like I belonged somewhere. She looked around the room at the faces watching her. Some sympathetic now, some ashamed, some still confused. But the moment I walked through those doors, Dorothy continued, I was treated like I didn't deserve to be here. Not because I was rude. Not because I was loud. Because of who they decided I was the second they looked at me. Her voice grew stronger. And when I chose to leave, when I chose dignity over argument, someone ran after me. Not to apologize. Not to make it right. But because he knew what happened in here was wrong. Dorothy turned to Ethan. And now you want me to disappear quietly, she said. Because I saw something years ago. Because I spoke up when I should have stayed silent. Because I believed the truth mattered more than keeping powerful people comfortable. Ethan's jaw tightened. You can't erase me, Dorothy said. Not anymore. Kim's voice cut through the silence. Ms. Turner is under my protection. Effective immediately. Ethan's eyes narrowed. You're making a mistake. No, Kim said. You made the mistake when you thought she was alone. He pulled out his phone and made a call, never breaking eye contact with Ethan. When someone answered, Kim spoke clearly enough for nearby tables to hear. I need security at Riverton Prime. Full detail. Now. He hung up. If you approach her again, Kim said quietly. If you follow her, if you so much as speak her name in the wrong room, you'll answer to me. And everyone who works with me. Ethan stared at him for a long moment, calculating. Then his expression shifted. Not defeat, but recalibration. He couldn't erase Dorothy quietly anymore. Too many people had seen. Too many phones were out. Too many witnesses. The moment had slipped away from him. Ethan adjusted his cuffs. This isn't over. Yes, Kim said. It is. Ethan turned and walked out of the restaurant without another word. Dorothy exhaled, her hands shaking. Kim looked down at her. Are you all right? Dorothy nodded slowly. I think so. Around them, the restaurant slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed. Silverware clinked. But the energy had changed. Madison stood frozen near the hostess stand. And Dorothy Turner, the woman they'd tried to erase, stood in the center of the room, still standing. Dorothy and Kim walked out of Riverton Prime together. Not rushing. Not fleeing. Just walking, steady, deliberate, side by side. Behind them, the restaurant remained silent. Diners watched through the glass windows, their meals forgotten, their phones still in their hands. Madison stood at the hostess stand, her face pale and uncertain. Brett had disappeared into the kitchen. The evening air hit Dorothy's face, cool, clean, carrying the familiar sounds of the city coming alive at dusk. Traffic hummed. A siren wailed in the distance. Somewhere down the block, a street musician played saxophone, the notes drifting upward into the darkening sky. Dorothy stopped on the sidewalk and closed her eyes for a moment, just breathing. Kim stood quietly beside her, hands in his pockets, giving her space. When Dorothy opened her eyes, she looked at him. "I spent years making myself small," she said. "After the courthouse. After I made that call. I learned to walk into rooms quietly, to leave before anyone noticed, to never draw attention." Kim nodded, listening. "I thought that was survival," Dorothy continued. "I thought keeping my head down meant staying safe." "And now?" Kim asked gently. Dorothy looked back at the restaurant, at the lights spilling out onto the sidewalk, at the building that had tried to dismiss her. "Now I think maybe safety isn't the same as living," she said. Kim's expression softened. "You were brave tonight." Dorothy shook her head. "I was tired." "There's a difference." "No," Kim said firmly. "Tired people walk away. Brave people stand still when everything in them wants to run." Dorothy felt her throat tighten. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. A black car pulled up to the curb. Kim's security detail, two men in dark suits who moved with the same controlled precision Kim carried. Kim turned to Dorothy. "I'm going to make sure Ethan can't reach you. Not at your home. Not at your church. Nowhere." Dorothy stiffened. "I don't want to be someone's project." "You're not," Kim said. "This isn't charity, Dorothy. You saved my life. You did it without asking for anything. Without knowing who I was or what I could do for you." He paused. "And years ago, you saved someone else. Someone you didn't know. Someone who couldn't repay you. You've spent your whole life protecting people who couldn't protect themselves." His voice grew quieter, more serious. "Let someone protect you for once." Dorothy studied his face. This man who'd run after her on a sidewalk, who'd stood beside her in a room full of strangers, who'd refused to let her be erased. "This isn't about debt," she said carefully. "No," Kim agreed. "It's about doing what's right. The way you always have." Dorothy took a slow breath, then nodded once. "All right," she said. "But I'm not hiding." Kim's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "I wouldn't expect you to." One of the security men opened the car door. Kim gestured for Dorothy to get in first. She paused, looking back one more time at the restaurant where she'd been mocked, dismissed, reduced to nothing. The same restaurant that had watched her stand back up. Dorothy climbed into the car. Kim slid in beside her. As they pulled away from the curb, Dorothy watched the city pass by through tinted windows. The same streets she'd walked for years, the same buildings, the same lights. But something had changed. Not the city. Her. Kim's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then at Dorothy. "One of the diners posted about what happened," he said. "It's already spreading." Dorothy's stomach dipped. "Is that good or bad?" Kim showed her the screen. The post wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. It was titled, "The Woman They Tried to Erase, and the Man Who Wouldn't Let Them." Dorothy read the first few lines, then looked away, overwhelmed. "You're not invisible anymore," Kim said quietly. Dorothy pressed her hand against the cool window glass. "Maybe I never was," she said. The car turned onto a wider street, merging into traffic, carrying Dorothy toward home, but not alone. Not this time. Behind them, Riverton Prime continued serving dinner. Madison would go home and wonder if she still had a job. Brett would delete the video he'd recorded. Ethan would make phone calls, recalculating his approach. But none of it mattered as much as it had an hour ago. Because Dorothy Turner, the woman they'd mocked because they thought she was invisible, had reminded them all of a simple truth. You can dismiss someone. You can disrespect them. You can try to erase them. But you can't make them disappear if they refuse to go. And Dorothy Turner was done disappearing. They mocked her because they thought she was invisible. They stopped when they realized she never was.